All right,
Cool.
ladies and gentlemen, super excited. This is going to be a fun conversation. Today's guest, Jen Sokol. I'm so excited to pick your brain. Well, it's funny. Our paths have kind of crossed
Yep.
in different ways for the better part of a decade
Yeah.
now.
Hmm.
And it's always so fun to run into you and, get some of your energy and get some insight from you and all that stuff. But for everybody listening, Jen is a business broker.
Correct.
And you've got some experience too in the entrepreneurship world, buying or starting, I should say, rather, a business, selling a business.
Hmm.
And now obviously your full-time gig is helping other people buy and sell businesses.
Yep.
And so I'm super excited to pick your brain and learn as much as I can from you about that front. But before we do, I would love a little bit of your background. I'd love to hear a little bit of your story and walk me through kind of we were talking off camera too, that you were a personal trainer
Yep.
for a while and all these different hats, but tell me how you got into the business broker. Tell me how you got into the business broker world.
Gosh, that's a good question. It feels like kind of the Durango Tango happened. Everyone here has multiple jobs,
Yeah.
but I started in fitness when I was, I don't know, probably 20. So I was a personal trainer, got into gym ownership at some point in my 20s. And I think I mean, you're asking me this question. I'm like, well, how did this happen? My personal training client is now the guy that I work for in business brokerage. And I was asking him about how to sell my partnership in a gym that I had. And we sat down. He's like, well, what are you planning to do? And I was like, well, I might go get an MBA or, something in business. And he's like, what about helping people buy and sell businesses?
Right.
So it's kind of one of those where like I hadn't really thought about it before. And then suddenly I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. I'll check that out.
You were the client and then yeah, you
And
got to
turned it.
experience the client side first.
Yeah. And now that I go to all these business broker conferences every year, and most business brokers find business brokerage by selling a business.
Oh,
A
interesting.
lot of them were entrepreneurs, started a business, went to sell and realized it's this whole world of like, how do you value it? How do you sell it? Where it feels pretty daunting. And so when you start diving into it and finding that there's actually someone who does this,
Right.
it was kind of cool. I was like, oh, maybe I don't want to own another business. I can just help other
How people
people.
buy and sell their businesses. It's funny. So
Mm,
my wife's a real estate broker,
yes. Yeah.
and she has a similar. When we bought our first house, she was like, I
Right.
loved that, loved the process, and loved like all the learning and stuff. And then obviously, dug in and did it. So I can totally see how being the customer and like experiencing it on that side could
Hmm.
give you the insight to know to, jump into it from a career perspective.
Yeah, and I realized it's a really emotional, big process. So most people, their business is their baby. Not always, but it's their retirement plan often. They spend their life working in this business, and then selling a business is it. There's a lot to it. It just entails a lot.
Yeah.
So being able to help people along with that process and make it a little bit less stressful has been pretty rewarding. So
Talk to me about that. So you were saying that I forget your exact words just there, but basically you alluded to the fact that selling a business is a beast.
yeah.
There's all these complexities with it, and then you have the emotional
Hmm.
component too.
Oh yeah.
Like it's somebody's baby, and I mean I think about my company and like how much I love the brand. Like
Yeah.
and I'm just like emotionally attached to the brand
Right.
of it. Even I could do without sometimes the day to day,
Right.
but I love the brand and the idea of it. But I'm curious, like, from what goes in, why is it so complicated? Like, talk to me about that. Because for so many business owners,
Hmm.
it's their retirement, and they've worked their whole lives on this, and then there's these complexities. Walk me through what some of those complexities are, and just some stuff that people could be looking for.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is how do you value a business? People, there are a ton of misconceptions. Please don't Google it and then tell me what you think it's worth. Because that usually ends in disappointment. I have people come to me saying, I'm pretty sure my business is worth $5 million. And then I do a valuation and it's worth, $50,000.
Right.
Um, so I think that's one of the first starting points. I need profit and loss statements and tax returns for the last 3 years, current balance sheets, just all the financials, copies of leases, that kind of stuff. And even starting there, I have people who don't know what a P&L is, or, they haven't filed their taxes in a few years, or they're not completely honest on their taxes. And We have to start with solid financials. Like you have to have good bookkeeping, basically.
Right.
Um, so that's the first hurdle is get me all your financials. I can do an opinion of value and tell you what I think it's worth. Usually, not always, but often that's where people get kind of crushed, because again, they've put their blood, sweat, and tears into this thing. So they think, well, it should be worth $5 million. But it comes down to what is the market support? What will a lender lend on it? And really, how much money does the business make?
Right.
You
Yeah.
know?
That's been one of the hardest things for me transitioning from corporate world to business ownership
Hmm.
is my whole career, all I really cared about or was compensated on or reported on or anything was top line,
Yeah.
revenue.
Right.
And so I started a business and I'm like, revenue, revenue, revenue. And then I'm like,
Mm,
ooh, that doesn't matter at
mm,
all.
It matters a little,
A
but
little, but I mean, we were just talking off camera about my price increase dilemma, but realizing how important the bottom line
yeah.
is, and that was such a hard shift for me to like
Yeah.
focus on that because
Yeah.
there's 1,000 moving pieces where the top line there's one it's sales,
Right.
sales and retention, I guess,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
and then everything else in between. I'm curious, walk me through. So you were talking about books and if people were honest with their taxes, is I think the way we worded it.
Hmm.
And we're all in business for a reason. And there's
Right.
a lot of benefits to,
Yes.
to business ownership. I found, so I recently did a real estate transaction this last calendar year. And it was interesting to like see the things that the bank, looked at in terms of my income.
Mm.
And then I look at what Uncle Sam
Mhm.
looks at in terms of my income, and then I look at my actual income,
Yeah.
and nowhere are they even remotely similar. I'm curious from your perspective if somebody's thinking about a eventual exit,
Mhm.
and I don't know, let's just say for conversation, a 5-year timeline or a
Mhm.
couple years. What's best practices or your advice in terms of the financial component of it? Because there's so many pros and cons to like how much you make, how much the business makes,
Right.
how much taxes you pay,
Right.
all of that stuff.
Well, number one, if you're thinking about selling in like 5 years, contact me or someone like me today. It helps me a lot to be able to talk to someone for years leading up to a sale versus when they call me and say, I want to sell tomorrow, I'm ready to go. I can't sell a business in a day. I
Do you
mean,
do you get those calls?
yes.
Yeah, I
Yes.
I could see it, especially when like I've had those days when I'm like, okay, I'm done.
You're over it.
Yeah, I'm
100%.
gonna call someone.
And it bums me out because I wanna help people, and when they wait to call me until they're ready to retire today, and then I tell them, "Look, it'll take us 3 to 6 months to get on the market, and then it can take 3 months to 3 years to sell." And they're like, "But I'm ready to be out
Yesterday,
yesterday."
yeah.
And so what happens in that case often is that they stop working as hard in the business, and then the business value decreases.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I need you if you're gonna sell your business, I need you to keep doing everything the way you've been doing it to keep the numbers the same or rising so
Right,
that we can, defend the price that we're asking for.
right.
Um,
It takes 6 months to get to market.
Not always, but it just depends on how organized are you? Sometimes I'll request, like I said, 3 years of tax returns and P&Ls, a year-to-date profit and loss, and people take 2 months to get me that information, So it just really depends. The people that I have that are super organized and they get me stuff tomorrow, we can move pretty quickly.
Right. Yeah.
I just have had plenty of people kinda drag their feet and not realize, again, how big of a thing it is and how much I'll request, and, then we need to sit down and kinda dive into those numbers, and I have a lot of questions usually, so,
Yeah.
and something I wanted to talk about, I don't remember your exact question now, but, you were talking about numbers and Uncle Sam.
Yeah.
There's a term in business brokerage called seller's discretionary earnings, so it basically is the term for all the things that small business owners might write off that aren't necessary in their business. So I get people who are scared. They're like, well, my bottom line on my tax return isn't really reflective of the trip I took to Jamaica. That wasn't, I wrote that off, but it wasn't necessary for business. So we know that as an industry and we can add those things back in.
Oh, cool.
So I get people who are concerned, like I wrote off whatever, my car that I don't drive every day in the business, we can account for that. Lenders know that term, business brokers know that term. It's a common thing.
Seller's discretionary Earnings.
Earnings. So it's spending that is discretionary that
Right.
you are putting in, different categories in your P&L that basically a new buyer doesn't need to go to Jamaica to run your business,
Right.
using that example.
Right.
So it would be money that could either go to their bottom line or to their salary or whatever.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So those are some ways where, because that's what I'm curious about, is I would imagine that there's benefits to working with a business broker to
Yeah.
where you're maximizing the value of your business, but not necessarily, because there's still that game of like taxable income
Yeah.
and all of that.
Mhm.
Tell me more about that. So there's the seller's discretionary earnings.
Mhm.
What are some other like things that you look at from the valuation side of it?
I mean, that's a really big one. And I mean, keep in mind, I'm not a CPA. I always tell people, talk to your
People always
accountant.
confuse us with IT people, and I'm always like, I'm a
Right.
marketer. I don't have any
Right.
idea how to fix your emails.
Right, right, right. Yeah, it's a similar idea. I always have to like consult with your accountant and your lawyer about these things. Um, tell me again your question.
Oh, just curious about like the valuation side of it, and because like that's a huge one. I'm thinking about, and we're nowhere near that here, but I think about stuff like, well, because it kind of gets blended.
Mm-hmm.
Like my life and my business, honestly,
Yeah,
there's some times when genuinely it's a business expense, but it's
yeah,
like, I don't know, the kids drove with me to whatever, or like
right,
you're so ingrained in your business that
right.
sometimes those are really actually overlapping.
Mhm.
And so it's good to know that those actually are, there's a way to account for that, at least from a earnings perspective.
Absolutely. And that's where we sit down. Like I dig through your financials, but then I need you to sit down with me and kind of like dig through, like, was this truly personal? Was it truly for the business? It's obviously easier for me to work with financials that are completely clean, that no one writes anything off that doesn't have to do with the business, but that's rare.
Right.
Most small business owners just write off all sorts of stuff.
Right. It's kind of why we're in business.
It actually, that's true. It's like a perk of,
One of the few.
right.
Because it's funny. So I have a business partner, but I joke with her all the time. I'm like, man, I don't feel like I get the benefits of business ownership or the business of employee. Like
Right.
I have the all the stress and all the chaos and all the, uncertainty of a business owner
Yeah.
and the compensation and the benefits of an employee. I'm like,
Yeah.
what the heck am I doing wrong? But
Yeah.
that's because we're in growth mode and, there's all those things there. But
Yeah.
so tell me more about that. So from a buyer's perspective,
Mhm.
when people are looking at, businesses to acquire, what's usually the biggest thing that buyers are looking at?
Earnings. They're looking at that SDE, we call it SDE number. So on the ads, and most of my business sales are confidential. So I don't go around telling everyone, I have this business for sale because business owners don't want all of Durango to know
Yeah.
necessarily. It's a small town, as you know, but even in the city, that's the case. So in the ads, it'll say, um, something very vague like,
Right. Like a category of business or something.
yeah, in the Four Corners area. So I sold a glass services company and it's just glass services in the Four Corners. And then you have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. But what's listed in there is, revenue, but then SDE earnings. And buyers tend to be, I'd say 75% of my buyers are not from the industry they're buying into, which is fascinating.
Say that again.
75% of my buyers are not from the industry they're buying into.
Interesting.
It is.
Remind me to come back to that.
Yeah. My sellers are always like, oh, I can't sell to them. They've never owned a restaurant, but they're business people.
Hmm.
So they understand how to run a business. They understand how to deal with employees and they can learn the nuts and bolts of running a restaurant, for example. And it is an interesting thing, but I've seen it succeed a lot. So they often are entrepreneurs or people that, they don't want to work for somebody else. They're looking at a business that has $1 million in revenue, $300,000 in SDE in these industries. And I get calls a lot where they just say, I don't want this or this, but I'm open to.
To any of the other
Mhm.
8 or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. And because we're in Durango, so I travel. I mean, we're in a small area, so I've taken listings in Junction, down in Farmington, like Salida. I mean, I've even driven to Gallup.
I used to spend, I don't know if you know this or not, but I used to sell phone book ads in Gallup.
Oh my goodness.
It was, in fact, I've one of these days I'm going to make myself a trophy. I had a growth phone book year in 2019 in Gallup. I grew a
2019.
phone book assignment in Gallup, New Mexico in 2019.
That's
Something like give
impressive.
myself an award for it, you know.
Yeah.
Grew the print revenue in 2019. It was wild times. But actually Gallup's an interesting place for business. Gallup's got a really stable economy
Mhm.
and a lot of really good businesses, and it's anyway, it's an interesting thing. I don't mind I don't mind spending less time there, but
Right.
from a business perspective, it was so eye-opening. Those were some It's funny, I haven't thought about that in forever, but that was an interesting chapter of my life. We'd go down, we they would give us hotel rooms for the whole month, and then we'd go and stay from like Monday through Friday and just sell. Like it
Interesting.
was like we could have made a movie about it. Just
Yeah.
sales culture, and like we were running down just because we'd have to do a full book, and then I was selling digital too, so I would
Mm.
sell websites and all sorts of stuff. It was a wild. Those were some interesting learning
Yeah.
years for me. Is the times in Gallup. Anyway, sorry for the anecdote.
That's okay. I didn't actually end up taking that listing in Gallup, but I didn't want to have to drive to Gallup all the time.
Right.
So and something that I pride myself in and that I try to do is be present for every showing. I try to be very just present for my sellers. Like I said, it's an emotional thing. So I like taking listings that I know that I'll be able to be there.
Yeah.
And sometimes Denver brokers will take listings in this area and they don't want to drive down here. So
Right.
they're never there, you know? People ask me, why should I hire you? That's one of the many reasons.
I'm here.
Yeah, in a small town. And I think where I was going with that is it's an interesting market because people want to move to Durango.
Hmm.
So it's not necessarily this big business hotspot, but it's a hotspot. So I get buyers that call me that say, I want a profitable business. I've had my last like 5 closings were probably people who wanted to live in this area. Younger, having a family, they want a profitable, sustainable business.
Right.
And again, they were business people, so they were like, I don't care if it's not in wherever I came from. The whole point is that they're trying to shift industries.
Trying to, yeah,
Yeah.
which is fascinating.
Hmm.
I'm curious about that. The 75% or something like that you said are buying businesses that that they don't have experience in that industry with.
Yep.
I've been seeing a bunch of stuff about, I'll butcher the term, but it's basically like that the real money's in the boring businesses,
Mhm.
or like your I don't know, home services, or the ones that aren't as flashy as you
Right.
would think, like tech, or,
Right.
gosh, digital marketing or whatever. But, all these were, kind of this new, there's, sort of like the new, I don't know, business era, digital techie type stuff. And then there's like your tried and true, businesses that are,
That's
less
true.
flashy.
Right.
Has that been the case in your experience that's where the money is, and that's where investors should be looking, or is that a misnomer on?
I think that's misleading because my experience is in this market. Like
Right.
if I talk to brokers in Denver, that's probably not the case.
Right.
I specialize more in that kind of industry because that's what Durango has.
Right.
So I've done really well selling businesses like glass services, garage door services, water delivery company, where in other parts of the country they don't even know what a water.
What even is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
And why would you need water
Right.
delivered? So that is the case here. I like those listings for sure.
Yeah. So I'm
Mhm.
curious, one thing, I'll share a quick anecdote without sharing too much details, but I was exploring the purchase of another business,
Mhm.
little while ago. And, there was no broker involved, and we were doing our due diligence and whatever. And after a while, I decided that it wasn't a good fit
Mhm.
for me. Um, and unintentionally, I think, hurt feelings along the way.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, but in hindsight, what I'm getting at is, and in fact, well, it's one of the reasons why I reached out to you. But I realized in hindsight, I'm like, man, we should have had a broker,
Mhm.
because just even for that, somebody to be in between,
So true.
you
So
know, because and it was the blind leading the blind,
yeah.
and we went into it with very good intentions,
Yeah.
both of us, thinking like, hey, this will be a win-win. We're both good people. We'll shake hands, like it'll be this great thing. And then it gets complicated
Yeah.
and it's tough.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I'm just kind of curious if you've if you've seen that or if I'm an anomaly with the.
No, no. So my technical term, I'm a certified business intermediary. I'm a master certified business
Well, thank you.
intermediary.
I should not call you just a broker then. Yeah,
Well,
but
you know, it's
that's a
fine.
mouthful. I won't be able to get.
Yeah, exactly. I tell people I'm a business broker. That makes more sense. But I say this a lot. My job is not just with the numbers, it's with the human interaction part of it.
Yeah,
And I am the intermediary. And so here we have a business owner who created this business from babyhood, infancy, and grew it to this thing. And a new buyer comes in and says, well, you do that in a really dumb way, and I'm going to change this. And, I don't like the way you do this. And so I'm the one who buffers that and relays messages in a way that keeps everyone happy. And it
right.
doesn't always work, but I just had a closing in the last month, and the day before I was getting yelled at by a lawyer on the East Coast, and tensions were high, and so a lot of my job is putting out fires.
Yeah,
It really is, and it's my goal to have buyer and seller equally happy
right.
at the end. And I love it's very rewarding. And the last one I did, that was the case. They were both like, thank you so much.
Win-win.
Win-win. And we had those little things along the way where, buyer would call me and say, I don't know how to move forward with this. I don't want to offend the seller because I really like what they've done. However, so it is a part of my job to be the buffer.
Yeah, yeah. A buffer would have been very good.
And it's again, it's emotional, and usually there's big numbers involved, so it's
Right.
stressful.
And livelihoods are on the line, like
100%.
on both parties,
Yeah.
like I can't even imagine, I mean, I obviously I have a very different perspective of the real estate,
Mm-hmm.
which is stressful and huge and whatever,
Yeah.
but it's still like a thing,
Yeah.
and you can buy and sell it or rent it or whatever. Like we're a business though, it's so consuming.
That's actually something I wanted to specify. People get confused and call me a real estate agent. I do have a real estate license in the state of Colorado, but I sell the entity,
Right.
the LLC, the corporation. Sometimes there's real estate associated, there's asset value associated, but it is very different from selling a house. And so I get a lot of misconceptions and confusion on that.
Yeah.
People say, oh, well, the real estate's not involved, so it's not worth anything, right? And I'm like, it's worth a lot. That one's worth millions,
Right.
even without real estate.
Right.
So yeah, that's
What's the biggest business you've ever sold or been a buyer? Like, what's the biggest transaction? I'm just curious.
oh gosh, I don't
Ballparking. Like if like millions.
probably between 1 and 5 million, which
Okay.
in business brokerage, there's different. Specialize in what's called Main Street business brokerage. So Main Street being like the bread and butter of Durango,
Yeah.
like the mom and pop shops. It's what people buy to have a livelihood. And then you move up to middle market from there, and that's like bigger city stuff. And then above, like, I don't even know the exact numbers, but mergers and acquisitions are like the multi-million
The
dollar
big dogs.
yeah, $50 million.
Right.
You hear about that kind of stuff.
Right.
We don't have a lot of those in Durango.
Right.
I mean, I think
Yeah.
we have some.
Just kidding.
Yeah. But I also like working with the people I work with. They're in the business. They're emotional about it. They're connected. They're like enthusiastic about their businesses. So I'm not trying to specialize in mergers and acquisitions where
Right.
it's, $50 million deals where you have private equity groups and 20 attorneys and so on. It's like I know a lot of the players here, like the accountants, the lawyers, the landlords. I've done deals with the same landlord, multiple businesses in a row. And that's cool. It's like the small town Durango
Right.
thing,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And let you do it right. And that's the thing too, where business can get so complicated is it's like at the end of the day, they're all just people businesses.
Yeah.
Like no matter what we sell or offer or service or whatever,
Mhm.
it's people doing business with people.
Right.
And I think people lose sight of that
Right.
so much,
Right.
especially probably at the transaction level.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that makes Durango so cool,
Yeah.
that we get to like see each other and,
Yeah.
run it. It's also what holds us accountable
It does.
because we have to run into each other at the grocery store.
Well, and that's even more to your point of wanting to keep it on good terms, right? Like you're not going to buy a business from someone and then never see them again in this town.
Right.
And often, because like I said, 75% of my buyers are not from the industry.
Right.
We have a consulting agreement. So there's usually 30 to 60 days of training included in the deal. And then from there, you might need to call your seller 6 months later and say, this new thing came up in a different season. How do I do this?
Right.
And if you don't have a good relationship, you're not going to be able to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I can't even imagine the things that would pop up of like,
right,
the login from the other thing or
right.
the, whatever.
Yeah, and in some cases, like when I sell service-based, industry, I sold a ski shop, for example. I've sold a bike shop. Those are seasonal. So if you buy a bike shop in December, come July, you're gonna have a lot of questions
Right.
about how to run this business.
Yeah. Good point.
Yeah, and same with the ski shop. So,
Talk to me more about the buyers. I'm curious, and I don't know necessarily if you get to see if you get perspective or even if it's just anecdotal of,
mhm,
the success after the
mhm.
business. But I'm curious if you have any observations or trends of like the types of buyers that are successful, or even maybe the mindset going into buying a business that
Mm.
increases the likelihood of success.
Gosh, that's a good question. I don't know that there's a specific type. It seems to me that people who are willing to buy a business and go through this, like I said, it's kind of a beast of a process, to use your term. They're usually motivated.
Right.
And most of
Do they usually come from money? Do they usually have money already?
um so to buy a business, you can anticipate that you will have to have 20% down.
Okay.
So if you see, a $100,000 sale price, expect that you'll need $20,000 to do the deal to begin with. So my buyers, I actually have you sign a non-disclosure agreement before you know anything about the business, and part of that is qualifying if you have the money to even do the down payment. Because if you don't, we're not going to waste our time.
Right.
The banks require it. No business can be sold without some sort of down payment. A lot of them, though, come from they have that down payment because they've been working hard. It's not like they just come from money.
Right.
They're coming from another industry. They sold a business, that kind of thing. So,
Is there such a thing as seller financing in the business world or
so
like
these are a lot of the things that the reason my job turns into a lot is like, here are a lot of things to think about. Seller financing is great. It's a great option, kind of. If we can eliminate
with an
a
asterisk?
right. Yes, exactly. If we can eliminate a bank, we can get a deal done in like 3 weeks, like just have all the attorneys agree. I draw up all the paperwork, so I have everything we need to do these deals, and then just have lawyers review them. Lenders can take 90 days to just get through the underwriting process, and it's the last one I did. We had like 200 pages that I had to print out and get notarized and signed, and
Jeez.
yeah. So seller financing is absolutely a thing. The thing is, most sellers are selling because they don't want the business anymore. If the buyer defaults, they have to go through the whole process of getting the business back.
Oh, right.
Often, buyers may have run the business into the ground. So now, is it worth anything? I don't always sell businesses with high asset value either. So you don't have to have $500,000 worth of assets to sell a business. So in that case, you're getting just the entity back, and it may not be worth what it was worth before.
Right.
So I always
So that's risky from a seller perspective.
Yes. However, the SBA requires sellers to finance 20%. They want to see that the seller of the business has enough like confidence in the business succeeding that they're willing to be on the line for 20%.
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So for an SBA loan, the
Mm-hmm.
seller
Has
has to back essentially 20% of the loan.
exactly.
Interesting.
Yep. So
Even though the bank's involved and
Mhm.
I had no idea.
Yeah. And so this is a conversation I have right off the beginning. Before I take a listing, I say, what are your thoughts on this? And if people say I'm not willing to do it, then I counsel them that I might not be able to sell their business.
Because of limitations by not having SBA as an option.
Or, a lot of lenders require it. So if they're not willing to finance any, we might not be. Everyone wants a cash buyer,
Right.
and they want a cash buyer who's willing to spend way more than their business is worth. And I always try to tell people this cash buyer didn't earn their money by spending too much on businesses
Right.
and losing money.
Right.
They're not gonna, we don't just get cash buyers. We have to have a financing solution.
Yeah.
So um I don't necessarily take listings if the seller isn't willing to at least consider
Back some of it.
a small amount.
Yeah.
And it's because of the lending solution. Like, where's the money coming from?
Right.
You know?
So how does that work? Walk me through that. Buyer still needs 20% down.
Mm-hmm.
Banks backing the other 80,
60.
60.
You-
Yeah.
so-
And then the seller's backing 20.
Yeah. And this
Who gets
is-
paid off first?
And that's a good question. And that's part of the challenge too. So usually if SBA is involved, the seller is on standby. And so they often don't even start taking payments for 2 years.
Wow.
I know.
So,
Bank gets money first is the point.
yeah, of course.
Yeah.
They always do.
Mhm.
And then after 2 years, though, some payments start going to
Yes.
the seller.
Yes.
But they got well, or at least 20%. They got a lump sum.
Well, no,
They got all of it.
theory, they got 80% at closing.
Right.
And that's what I tell them too. So let's say the buyer defaults, and in 2 years you get the business back.
But you still got 80% of your money.
Right.
Right. And your business back.
Right.
So there's some less risk.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But this is why, I had a buyer inquire and asked if my seller would do 100% seller financing. And I was like, no, that's not a thing. And the buyer got angry with me. But why would a seller, they would get nothing at closing in that case.
Right. Right.
It just doesn't
They
make
need
sense.
something.
They
Yeah.
need something.
You can't just walk away.
Mm-mm.
How does that typically work? Because I'm curious, it's so hard to have a profitable business to begin with.
Mhm.
And I'm lucky, like we started Ascent Digital with 20 grand,
Right.
like, nothing, but a bunch of hard work and determination and whatever, and really proud of how it's grown. But even still, I was mentioning it earlier, how tough it is to pay attention to that bottom line,
Yeah.
and actually having profit, especially if you're looking at it after owner's comp, like the actual thing. So I'm curious how that works or what your experience has been. And now if you had, because what I'm getting at is, and now you have to introduce a loan payment,
Right.
a big one,
Right.
usually,
Right.
some, does that change the dynamic of what's profitable and how, a business buyer can get by? Because now they've got to make a living,
Mhm.
support their business, and pay off this loan that got them there.
Yeah.
Does that, or is that usually kind of worked in, and the businesses that are being sold are profitable enough to
I feel like
have that?
if you ever want to sell, come to me, because you're thinking of all these things that people don't think of, and it makes my job easier. So
That's my problem.
Yeah.
I'm always thinking too much, but
right. Yes, that's another thing I counsel sellers on. So we have a sale price, that I advise on the sale price. Here's what I think it can get. And people say, well, why can't we ask $500,000 for my $100,000 business? And it's this discussion is part of that. How the justification of purchase price, how will your business pay the new buyer a living wage, pay the debt service, and provide for any new capital expenditures
and run the business.
run the business. And so I usually do a spreadsheet and just a quick, like, okay, if it's this sale price, if the debt service is this, the seller's going to make $20,000 a year working 100 hours a week in the business.
Which might be the case anyway.
True. Yeah, exactly.
Welcome to business ownership, buddy.
Right. Yeah, that's true. But,
Regardless of the loan, but
yeah, but buyers tend to be looking at those things, and so do banks. So banks don't want to lend on something that isn't going to survive.
right.
So again, a big part of my job is counseling people along the way of like, I come up with a number. I don't just make it up. Here's why I think your business is worth this.
Right.
And here are some other things to think about along the way. Like, how will they survive? And then, do you, the seller, want to finance a business that you're asking too much for that can't support the debt service?
Well, right. Because now you're at risk.
Right. Right. And none of them want to do that.
No.
They want to.
Funny how that works. Once
Yeah.
the tables are turned.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Would you back this?
Right.
So I was telling you about, and the the real estate transaction I did last year, it's actually, we bought an Airbnb
Mhm.
in Moab. So it's a business, but it's it was a real estate,
Right.
it was a real estate transaction. And I'm running the numbers and I'm, like poring over it. And I was thinking about this whole thing. And it was one of those, like, we had to go for broke to make it happen.
Mhm.
Like, drain our accounts. And I'm thinking, I've got my projections and I'm like, okay, I think it's going to work. But you want to know what actually gave me the confidence? That the bank thought it would too.
Right.
That's actually what was like, okay, they're going to lend it. They're going
Right.
to, and they lent it to us without, we didn't have to like get creative.
Yeah.
So then I was like, then
Right.
if they're confident in it, I am,
Right.
because they're fronting 80% of it.
Right.
I think we put down 20, maybe 25, but it's like, it's funny because I was able to like,
Mhm.
it helped with my confidence in taking the leap because I knew that they probably are smarter than I am with their
Yeah.
algorithms and whatever they're calculating that, it's a good investment.
They don't
enough
want to
for them.
lose money.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no one wants to lose money.
Yeah. That's another thing I do. Another benefit of having a business broker is I have contacts with lenders all over the country. So not all lenders will do business sales because of the collateral thing. Like
Yeah.
Airbnb, if you default, they get a house back,
Right.
right? Whereas I've sold a chiropractic clinic, for example, that had, $10,000 worth of assets.
Right.
So I love working with some of the local banks here, but most of them won't do it.
Yeah.
And so I've made connections with banks on the East Coast and, you know, it's tricky.
Are those usually at higher interest rate? Like
Uh,
a business loan?
oh, yeah, in general,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it does tend to be.
Higher risk.
I guess, I mean, what is I guess
Well, and there's no asset. Like to your, like it's less backed. I mean, I would imagine that probably the rates are probably quite a bit higher.
the last I checked, they were like 8%, but a year or so ago, they're up to 11% for SBA loans.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, and I wasn't selling many businesses then,
Right.
you know?
Or is business transactions picking up right now?
I've been talking about this to other brokers. So I have connections all over the country and into Canada. And last year was slow for everybody, which is typical for election years.
Sure.
I anticipated picking up now because, everyone knows what's happened with the election. So in theory, things will move. It hasn't as much in Durango.
It's interesting.
I
Neither
just
has real estate. And we were thinking that it would kind of take off, especially now that interest rates are going down,
Yeah,
and it's still kind of sitting around.
it is.
It's
And
interesting.
talking to other brokers, it is starting to pick up elsewhere. So it might just be Durango's a little slow.
Maybe we're late to the game. Let's
Yeah,
hope.
I know. Yeah.
April's going to be gangbusters for all
Yeah.
of us. How about that?
Usually in January, I get so many calls. People are like looking at running their business for another year and they're like, I can't do it. I can't even consider it.
Right.
And so that's when I just start getting calls and I will consult with anybody for free, like sit down, have coffee, just talk on the phone about the whole process. But this year that has not been the case.
Interesting.
It is.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Have you seen, so I sometimes I wonder, I don't know necessarily if my sphere of influence is changing or if like the world is changing, it's yeah, or both.
Mm,
It seems to me though, like there's a surgence of entrepreneurs and like people are becoming aware of like business ownership as a path
yeah.
as opposed to more of the traditional, go to college, get a job, climb the ladder thing.
Yeah.
The business ownership thing, and again, that might be biased, like I might have some skewed perception on it, but I'm curious your thoughts on that, like if you've seen that there's some trends or some shifts happening just culturally, like nationwide, of people being more interested in
Yeah.
business ownership, or if I'm choosing that's reality.
Well, again, I'm in the same boat you are. Like my sphere of
That's who
influence
we talked to.
is
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But I do agree with you. The other kind of cultural shift that I've talked to people in finance about is boomers who
I was gonna get there. Love it.
they're not selling.
Yeah.
They don't want to retire. And so in my industry and a financial planner I spoke to recently too was saying, we've anticipated this, oh, boomers are all going to sell off and then there's going to be all this wealth. And it just isn't happening. And
Mm.
I was talking to my dad about this recently and he's like, oh, see, I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
He's a retired colonel in the Air Force and he's still working full time fixing tractors. And he always will because he doesn't
Is
wanna
that by
sell.
necessity or want?
It's by want.
Do you think most boomers are working because they want to or because they have to? Anecdotal, like I know you don't know.
It
But
feels like it's a want thing.
yeah,
It's I don't want to stop doing this thing. What am I going to do? What I hear is like, what am I going to do?
right.
I don't want to sit around. So again, in my industry, we have this huge anticipated sell off, but it just keeps not
Do
happening.
you know, and I don't, if you don't, no problem, but I'm just curious if like what percentage of businesses are owned by
I don't.
boomers, or I would imagine though it's the vast majority,
A lot. Yeah.
at least the successful established ones,
Right.
just
Right.
a numbers game,
Hmm.
but yeah, because I've been interested about that. I think I'm wondering your take on it because I think that there's a huge opportunity if
Yeah.
somebody can figure out how to tap into that.
Right.
All these boomers that are sitting on
Agreed.
successful businesses and maybe like don't know how to get out or maybe don't want to or whatever. I'm
Yeah.
just curious your thoughts on
I
thoughts
mean,
on that.
I'd love to know because it's my it's my livelihood.
We'll
There's
figure it out. I'm all-
yeah, there's so many, and if they would sell, then that would benefit me too.
right.
But I don't know. Like I said, talking to people like my dad and other business owners, they're just like, I don't want to stop doing this yet.
Yeah.
I don't want to be bored. I don't want to just, I think there's this concept now of retirement that you just kind of wither and die, and it's
Yeah.
very bleak, versus continuing to do this thing that you've done and you enjoy and you're good at. So it makes sense to me. It's just a shift.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I was at an agency conference a couple weeks ago. And it was with all these super successful agencies. I loved it actually because it was really nice for me to be the dumbest guy in the room.
Yeah,
And I loved
I
that. Like
get
I
that.
was a sponge the whole time. I was
Mhm.
taking so many notes and I learned a ton. But there's basically two thoughts that people have. And of course it makes sense. Like we either need to get our business to a point where it runs itself
Mhm.
or
Right.
sell,
Right.
exit, like one path or the other. And what's interesting is that at least in the agency space, the same things have to occur for either outcome.
Mhm.
Like you have to have the systems in
It's
place,
true.
you've got to have all of that. And, because the value of the business is not nearly as much as if it all is on your shoulders.
Right.
I'm curious if you've seen that in other industries or because I'm wondering my point of that, the curiosity of that one is I wonder if boomers maybe aren't selling because they don't need to.
It's going well.
They've got income and
Yeah.
they've got a manager in place or whatever. And
I see a little bit of both. And, keeping in mind most people that call me want to get out.
right.
So I talk to people who
Yeah, there's a little bias on
there
there.
is,
Yeah.
yeah. But I talk to a lot of my sellers have good systems in place, and they want to see the business continue with someone with a fresh take.
Mm,
I have some great local businesses right now currently that I'm selling that are like, we've been here 30 years. It's time to just have someone else like revision this thing,
right.
which is part of the reason I like working with the demographic I do. Like I said, the Main Street business owners.
Because you've got the emotion involved.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Because I would imagine in that world that the legacy matters
Yeah.
as well as the dollar.
It does, and name recognition in Durango is a thing. I get to pick and choose what listings I take. I advise everyone. I always tell them, I'll tell you what you need to know, not necessarily what you want to hear. Um, but part of that is that I get to pick. Like I know these businesses. I've been here. I've lived here 20 years. I'm like I know this business has a great reputation. People love it, and I like working with those businesses.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. If somebody's listening right now and they're thinking about, I don't know, they've got the entrepreneur spirit
Mm-hmm.
and they're thinking about either starting a business or buying one.
Mm.
What would your response be just in terms of like pros and cons, things to be thinking about,
Yeah.
some of the thought process on, if you're deciding if you should start from scratch or buy an existing business?
I mean, a big part of my documents when I put them together on my business listings talk about like what is the point of buying this versus starting an existing one. So if you're looking at a business and there's no assets, it doesn't have name recognition, it doesn't have employees, it doesn't have systems, like what are you buying?
Right.
So it's a matter of seeing it, or has it been a business in Durango for 30 years? People know the name. You couldn't open something next door and do as good as this is doing. You want to see if it has all the systems in place. Yeah.
Yeah.
All the employees and all the stuff, and you might be able to do it better. But I'm not in the startup world, but the SBDC, the Small Business Development Center, is really cool here.
Yeah.
A lot of great resources. Um,
And we've got the great Center for Innovation
that is
now
really
from
cool.
that. I mean, it's
Mhm.
cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I'm a fan of the SBDC.
mm,
We go to their conference every year.
yeah.
Yeah. It's great
I
people.
knew about that. Yeah.
You should
I
go.
I will this year. I think
Yeah.
it's
Actually, wasn't that the one that we ran into each other at?
no,
Or that was economic development
economic
alliance. Okay.
development.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're different,
Mhm.
similar size.
Yeah.
It'd be valuable for you.
Yeah. I would like to
There's
go to that.
great people there.
Yeah. I think that's a good place for people to start if they're like, do I do a startup? Do I buy this existing business?
Yeah.
Like I said, it's not really my world. I just know the numbers and so on. And
Right.
just looking at those things, I think it's pretty simple to see quickly. This coffee shop has $5,000 in assets and no one goes there. And
Right.
maybe that's not the business to buy.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
How much weight does brand equity carry? Like name recognition? Any?
It does. I do mean like in the actual, is there a number on it?
Yeah,
Or do
just
you,
curious, or even if it's anecdote, but
yeah.
the, because I was talking earlier how proud I am of my brand, but I would imagine that a lot of business owners, my guess would be that a lot of business owners overestimate the value of the name.
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, there is value. And again, it's a kind of a small town, and people know that they're going to go to, whatever coffee shop because they know that coffee shop that I
Right.
have for a long time. There, what we don't do is add $100,000 onto the sale price because you have a name that people recognize.
Got it. It just makes it more sellable.
Right.
Not necessarily more valuable, but more
Yeah.
easier to sell.
So the thing is, it's all wrapped up. So because of the name recognition, you probably get a lot of clients and therefore you make a fair amount
You're
of money.
probably it reflects on the revenue.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So, but then people call me and they say, well, where is the name reflected in the sale price? And it's all kind of reflected in that.
Right. No,
Yeah.
that makes sense. It is in the numbers.
It's in the numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like just because somebody else buys it isn't going to change the numbers that
Right.
the brand brings in, but the brand's bringing in.
Right. But it is why I do take business listings here that I know have a good name and a good reputation, and that have been around for a while and that people want to go to.
Right.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
I find value in that as a longtime Durango local and as a business broker. I see the value in that.
Oh yeah, for sure. And the
Mm.
trust,
Yes.
the trust side of it.
Yeah. And then I get buyers who are like from I don't want to offend anyone, but from out of state.
Texas.
Yeah. Texas or California. And they come
We'll edit
in.
that. No, I'm kidding.
They come in and say like, oh, this is really cool. I'm going to change the name and I'm going to change the product line. And that's where I'm like, why are you buying this? Why are you buying this longtime Durango thing and then completely coming in and changing it? Those are the ones that I've seen historically not do as well.
Yeah.
Um,
It makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
You got to understand your market.
Right.
Too.
Right.
I'll call it a digital footprint, but I'm curious if an online presence impacts like how you rank on Google, website traffic, online reviews. Does that come into consideration when valuing a business, or is that similar to the brand that it's reflected in the revenue?
Yeah, it's kind of, if those things are necessary to run your business, then I need to see that you have that in place. But it's not like I'm going and checking before I take the listing. It's like the most important thing is looking at all these financials.
It's the numbers. Yeah.
It's the numbers because those tell the story.
Right.
If you're making $0, then maybe your digital footprint needs some work.
Right. Yeah.
Along with some other things.
Yeah. Maybe work on that before listing the business. Yeah.
Well, right. And that's why I say to people to call me now.
Right.
Because I'm happy to take a look at, we do full on appraisals as well, which is a whole different level and a whole different process. But I'm happy to take a look at financials, give an opinion of value. Like based on today's market, I feel like I could list this business for X amount. And if people don't like that, they're like, well, what can I do?
Yeah.
That
was my next question. And I know that it's nuanced. I know that there's like 1,000 variables, but
yeah.
Generally speaking, from your experience, we're having that hypothetical, I want to sell in 3 years call.
Yeah.
What usually are the things that people need to be doing?
Clean books. And part of clean books is I have a lot of people who take cash out of the business, right? So they are not reporting at all. And I can't do anything with that. Like
Right.
The bank's not, the IRS, like obviously I can't sell a business if you tell me, I made $100,000 in cash last year and I put it all in my pocket. I can't add that to the value. But what I tell people is invest in paying the taxes on that money so that you can get a higher sale price.
Right.
So if that's something that you're doing, which I don't call out anybody on that, but if you're taking cash, put it back in the business for a few years so that I can see that and lenders can see that. And that really, it changes the bottom line completely.
Yeah. It's interesting. I told you I've got a business partner,
Mm-hmm.
and that's actually one of the best parts about a partnership.
Mm-hmm.
There's tons of pros and cons to partnerships, as you know.
Yeah.
But one of them is that we have to have clean books.
Right.
Like nobody's taking cash. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
there's a cool, from a like official perspective,
Yeah.
it's really nice because it all has to be above board because
Yes.
there's lots of, there's people involved and there's nobody can take cash, or everyone is, but it wouldn't work, but
Right.
it's an interesting, I never thought of that from that perspective, but you're just talking about books and I'm like, man, that's one thing luckily we've had from the beginning is very clean books.
It makes my job so much easier.
And most of it's, part of it's probably from just like my business background. I've always been like I love looking at the P&Ls and I probably look at it way too much and kind of pour over that side of it. But also the partnership side of it, it by nature, it has to be clean.
Right.
So, and just an interesting kind of anecdote on partnerships. Speaking of that, actually, I'm curious, you mentioned early on that you had sold your partnership in a business.
Mhm.
How often does that happen? And what are the complexities with that? Like one partner wants out, or walk me through all that.
Yeah, that stuff. So we do get those calls, and that's a lot of our appraisals. So we can do appraisals for all different reasons: contemplation of sale, divorce, and buyouts. That's a big thing people ask. Mine was very simple. It was like I didn't need a business broker. It was a small percentage in a gym that I was a partner in, and we just like signed some legal documents, and that was that. So it just kind of depends. I don't tend to take those as listings.
Right.
My job, I do everything from valuation all the way to closing, including marketing. So I'm dealing with prospective buyers. A lot of times with a buyout, it's like in my case, my other partners were buying it out.
Yeah, so it's
So
easy.
yeah, so people
But will
will,
you broker a buyout? Like let's say there's a partner there, let's say there's a partnership, one of the partners wants out,
yeah,
and I don't know, either the other one buys them out or they get an investor or bring on a new partner or whatever, but
yeah.
do you broker those?
Um, I could, but I don't want people to waste their time or money on me. So a discussion I always have with people first is to figure out if I'm the best person for the job. Sometimes a lawyer is like, they don't need me, they don't need a business broker I'm not placing ads necessarily. So sometimes I just refer them directly to an attorney, but I'm
Right.
definitely always willing to have that conversation. Is this something that I can help you on, or do you just need to pay a lawyer to draw up a couple documents and get yourself out of it? So,
What are the other complexities with the partnership side of it? One of the things that came up, I was at that conference,
mhm.
and I forget exactly. Somebody was talking about that they bought out. I've obviously you know this by now. I have a podcast. I just ask questions when I want to.
I
But
love,
somebody was talking to me that they bought out their partners, and I was like, "How
yeah,
did you pay cash? Like, how in the world did you, like, how did that happen?" And what he told me was that they took into consideration that he would have to replace that partner,
right.
and that changed
The
so there
value,
wasn't that much to buy out anymore because
right,
he had to hire somebody to replace it.
right.
Talk with me about that. How does that work?
Well, even not in a partnership, we take that into
The
consideration.
owner's comp?
Yeah, yeah. So we can add owner's compensation back in, but let's say it's a partnership, two owners, and like your case, we'll use your
Yeah.
business as an example. Let's say you guys were selling and you're both working full time in the job and one person is buying. They're going to have to pay someone to do either your job or your business partner's job.
Right.
So we
Or
do,
two or three.
yeah, the thing that I do when I make the seller's discretionary earning is called a recast. So I'm recasting the financial statements and I add all of those things back in, good and bad. So we will say like, you wrote off all these things that aren't necessary. However, a buyer has to replace this person and their salary is going to be 70 grand a year. Another one we make adjustments for often is rent. If people own their own real estate and they're not selling the real estate with the business and they're paying a really low amount of rent, we have to say, well, you're going to charge double that to a new buyer, and that comes from the bottom line too.
Right.
So those things are taken into consideration.
If somebody owns, now you're making my gears crank. Because if you own real estate and your business rents it from you,
Mm-hmm.
that's just a true expense in the business, right?
Yes.
Huh. There's a good goal.
Yes.
There's the dream right there.
Yeah.
Own the building that your business rents.
So, and then what happens, and the reason, so I have a real estate license. I mentioned I have to, but a lot of the times the business and landlord owner, the owner keeps the real estate because there's already a successful business in it. So they sell the business entity and then they have a tenant that they know
Right.
is going to pay the rent.
Right.
So I don't always, even when they own both, they often call me and say, I just want to sell the business. I'm
Yeah.
like, keep the real estate.
Well, yeah.
Not always.
That's the first time that idea has popped into my head that you could pay rent to yourself.
Yeah. Yep.
That's brilliant. That's next level. There's the new goal. When that happens in
There
a
you
few
go.
years, I'll let you know that
Please
you get
do.
credit for that.
Yes.
Because that's like,
I don't get credit for that.
Yes, you
People
do.
do this all over
no,
the place.
you gave me the idea. That was good thinking.
Yeah.
Tell me more about like from your experience, your perspective. I want to know. We've talked a little bit about like the emotional components with the the demographics that you get to work with and
Mhm.
things like that. What's your favorite part about your job? Like what's the most fulfilling?
It's really rewarding. When I first started thinking about this, I just assumed it was This sounds terrible, but I assumed it'd be a boring business job, you
Right.
know? I was like, "Oh, I'm gonna be at a computer." That's not it at all. I tend to be good with people. I like human interaction. My background was in fire and EMS. Like, I worked on the ambulance for years. I was a personal trainer. I like that part of it. And people are so grateful when it's over. It's such a relief. Like I said, like my last closing, the buyer and seller both were like, "Thank you so much. I mean, this is a big ordeal and you helped us make it easier." And usually the seller is on a new life endeavor. Like it's life
It's
changing.
another chapter, yeah,
It's
for
another
both people.
exactly, and same with the buyers who, like I said, in a couple of my most recent closings were young families with kids and, starting a whole new life here and owning a business. And I mean, I had one seller tell me she wished she could buy me a car. She was like, "Thank you
She should have
so much."
written it off.
That's right. Yes. She got me a bottle of champagne and a plant, which I was very
That'll work.
happy with.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's good second tier,
Yeah.
second tier.
Yeah, it's just very rewarding when people are so grateful and it's such an immense, like big thing for them.
Do you have any stories of like that person that had the dream exit and how they got there or what it looked like? And I know, I'm not looking for specifics, obviously, but the, that I don't know, that business that had the dream exit that they wanted to have and how it went or anything like that.
My employing broker, Charlie, he's been doing this for about 30 years, and I tell him all of my sales, every one, he's like, "I don't know how you get such good, happy people who have these perfect situations." But yeah,
Manifesting it.
yeah, exactly. And I pick and choose. Like if people are rude to me, I assume they're not going to be great to work with for the next year.
Right.
So I get to pick and choose who I work with. But I had one man in his 60s. He'd run a service-based industry for 30 years, was incredibly fair every step of the way. I think a guy in his late 20s and his wife bought it and they had a new baby. And they were so happy. I usually call my buyers months later and just say, like, "How is it going?"
Yeah.
I like to know, how did this whole thing work out? And that particular buyer was like, "This was better than I even thought it was." And the seller made good money his whole career, was really happy to turn it over to this young guy, and he moved to, I think, Texas to be with his grandkids, and he was so happy.
And he did it.
Yeah,
Yeah, the
he did.
win-win.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen him go south? Like, I don't know if,
Yes.
so I'm curious about that. Like, the buyer buys it and it fails. If you've seen that, or if there's like common, you know, if you can see the writing on the wall, or like, I don't know, common traits
Yeah.
or things that you've seen that it's like, ooh, that's usually means it's maybe not going to go the way everybody thinks it goes. And the reason I'm asking, I'm an optimist to a fault,
Mm,
and truly to
me
a fault.
too. Yeah.
Like, and it served me really well. It's
Mhm.
great, but I jump and I ask questions while I'm in the air.
Right.
Like I'm like, let's do this thing. I trust my gut. Like, let's rock and roll. And I've been lucky, and usually I can outwork my bad decisions. Well, of which there are many.
I love that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I'll just like fix it. Like, I'll make it happen.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about that. If there's like, I don't know, words of caution or words of advice from where you've seen, the thing not go the way that it should have, or that could have been avoided.
Yeah, I don't know if they can be avoided. I've seen some where the new buyer and the landlord just didn't get along, and that's a rough one. Depending on the industry, sometimes the location is key.
Right.
And I think your case, you could probably move and it would be
Anywhere.
okay.
Yeah.
Not all businesses are like that.
Right.
So that's one. And I hate seeing that. Like it bums me out when people a year later call me and they're like, "I hate this."
Those are the ones we see in the newspaper, I'm sure.
Probably. And, to this point, I've been fortunate. No one has directly yelled at me.
Yeah.
You know, they understand that I'm not the landlord, but
See, but like that right there. That's an interesting one. So now, then, would there be due diligence that somebody could do to like get to know the landlord or understand the nuances of the lease? Which brings up another question. Sorry, but also employees,
yeah,
like the human element of it.
there's a lot and these are again all the things that I've been alluding to. Like there's so many parts of selling a business. The lease is a big one. That's another thing that before taking a listing, talk about, is the landlord on board or are they going to, because the landlord can kill a sale.
Yeah.
In the case of something downtown, for example, on Main Ave, and location is key. If a landlord says, "I'm not going to get a new lease with a new buyer," then I can't sell it. And I
Gosh, I can't think of a situation
yeah.
more frustrating as a
Yeah.
business owner than a landlord spoiling it.
Yes. And
You've
then
worked your
what?
whole life on this.
Exactly. And then what? Like, if I can't sell it, like no one can sell it if
Yeah.
the landlord's not on board. So, and I have not had a listing personally, but Charlie has, that the landlords have said, no, we're not going to do it.
Right.
And that, I mean, that's a terrible situation to be in.
Yeah.
Um,
What about the employees and like, how do people test that or do they?
Employees is this is a huge conversation that I have pretty much with every listing with both buyer and seller the whole way. Sellers don't tend to want to tell their
Of course
employees.
not.
Right. So, but you get that. But most sellers, or most people don't really understand that. And so buyers are like, why haven't you told your employees?
Because
Sellers,
I don't want them to know I'm selling.
I don't want them. And then if they all
And they would
leave,
panic. Yeah. The
yeah,
fear would be crazy. And
right.
who knows?
Which isn't always the case. I've had more than one sale where the seller told the employees and they were just really grateful. The thing that I remind both sides, the buyer usually really needs the employees.
Right.
They, not always, but they usually need pretty much everyone there to continue making the revenue that they have been.
Right.
And they're usually scared the employees will leave. The seller's usually scared the employees won't be taken care. And again, because I represent Main Street businesses,
They care.
they care. It's really cool. Like my sellers really do care about their people.
Yeah.
And vice versa on either side. So it's a conversation. It is my biggest goal to never be a used salesperson.
Right.
You know,
What's it gonna take?
yeah. So I always tell my sellers, you know, your employees better than I do. You know, it needs to be a comfort level thing with you.
Right.
It is much easier to sell a business if the employees know.
Yeah. Well, yeah,
Right.
I'm sure. But there's complications there too.
There's complications and then things come up. Like I list confidentially, I have some businesses that don't care. You know, they've put my information in their front window, like this business is for sale. But I had one where a buyer called the business. He's from Texas, I think, and he was really proud of himself. He figured out, even though it was a confidential ad, what the business was. He didn't call me. He called the employees and was like, "Oh, I figured this out. I want to talk about this, you know?" And so I always have to counsel my sellers too, like no matter how confidential we are, it is still possible
Word's
that
gonna get out. Yeah.
it's totally possible that
Not only
someone,
possible, but likely.
yeah, and that they might figure out it's your business when there's, you know, three of this
Generic
industry.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah, in Durango.
Right.
And in that case, luckily the employees all knew. They had my cards in front of them, and I just tell my sellers to tell your employees, call Jen.
Right.
We don't even engage about this. Like, but in the cases where employees haven't been told and then they hear some rumors on the street, you know, it's a stressful thing and it's just case by case.
Yeah. I can see now that we're talking it through though, how valuable it would be to, in a careful way, inform the employees
Yeah.
so that you stop the rumor mill.
Yes. Right.
And I would think from a buyer's side, like if I'm buying a business that relies on employees, I would want to make sure I get along with the employees.
Yeah.
Like it would almost be critical in the due diligence to like
Yeah.
really meet the team.
Well, and we don't usually do that before closing.
Really
Mm-hmm.
interesting.
I know.
So you've never had a buyer like demand that, or because if I'm in
Yes.
the buyer seat, I'm thinking that I like, especially if it relies on the employees,
Yeah.
that I would that have to make sure that
Yeah.
we jive.
Yeah. I've had buyers demand it and sellers say no.
Yeah.
You know, the seller gets to say that.
Right.
And in another case, I had a buyer demand it, and the seller was like, "All right, let's have a pizza party." And they did. They had a pizza party with the employees a month before closing, and it went great. And the buyer really he was like, "It is so important to me to keep these people." So he told them, "I'm giving you all a raise. I'm going to give you a bonus," and it went really well.
Yeah. If I was the buyer, that's exactly what I would do.
That's what I
I
tell.
would think, how can I pay them?
So the buyers always call me and they say, how do I ensure I'll keep my employees? I'm like, treat them well.
Yeah.
You know, treat them like people and be nice and
Be a human being.
be a human being.
What a concept.
It's harder than you'd expect.
Right.
Yeah, the employees conversation, that is a tricky one in almost every sale I have. And like I said, usually when we get a buyer on the line, they're usually calling me with these concerns and the seller is usually calling me with these concerns. And we have to, another difference between selling a business and a house is once we're under contract, I try to get us all together once a week.
I was going to say, so the buyers and the sellers communicate.
In my deals, absolutely. I don't know how else you could do it. I've
Yeah.
heard of other brokers, not necessarily business brokers. Sometimes real estate agents will take business sales, and I've heard of them not allowing that to happen. It just doesn't make sense,
Right.
and I usually try to, I'm present. We'll do a Zoom, a conference call, an in person. There's so many things to work out, like vendor accounts and questions about the employees, that if I just put them together, it goes much more
Yeah.
smoothly.
Are you only paid at like when a deal closes, like a real estate transaction?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's got to be, because again, I've got perspective into the real estate world, and
Mm-hmm.
I've seen my wife put literally hundreds of
Yes.
hours
Yes.
into deals that don't close. I've got to imagine this is even more
Yes.
complicated and more risky from your side.
It is, and the longer I've done this, I think I started in 2017, and when I started, I was like, I'll take any listing, and now I've seen enough financials, and even talking to people, like I said, if they're rude to me right off the bat, I'm like, I don't know how I'm going to sell your business if you can't even talk to, we're going to be working closely together
Right.
for a
With
year.
sensitive information
Right.
and high
Right.
emotions and
So I am picky. And sometimes I take smaller deals, it's all relative, but in the world of business brokerage, I've taken some smaller deals because I loved the sellers so
yeah.
much, and they're great. I was so happy, and it's, again, small town Durango stuff where, like, I see them on the street and they're like, "Thank you so much. I'm doing this now thanks to you."
Right.
Um so yeah, I have to consider that with every deal that I take. Can I sell this? And so that's where my opinion of price comes in too. If people say, I want to sell this for $1 million, and I say it's worth 100,000, I say I can't help you.
Right.
And that,
Because you can't put in the work if it's not going to sell.
yeah, and I have been wrong more than, like, I've been wrong a couple times. I've also taken some businesses at prices that I was mildly uncomfortable with, and I advise people, I don't think it can sell at this, but I'm willing to give it a shot because you have a solid business.
Right.
Sometimes I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Sometimes we sell it for that.
One time.
Right.
Only wrong
A
one.
couple.
Yeah.
I like it when I'm wrong that way.
Yeah.
It's harder when I take and people forget that I told them, a year ago that I won't sell at this price, and then they call me mad at me.
Right.
And
I should say it in
yeah,
whatever.
I want to like put it in writing. Refer back to our email.
Nicole will do with the real estate side, like she'll be like, yeah, sure. But if it's not at that, if we don't have, and she'll quantify it. Like we don't have X number of showings or an offer or whatever at these dates, then
I do
shift it
do that
down.
as well.
Yeah.
So I do often say, we'll sign this year-long agreement. We're going to have price changes at 3-month intervals.
Right.
It just depends, it's case by case. It really, I have sellers who I call them, I say, here's what I think it's worth. And they say, great, I trust you. Let's do it.
Yeah. Rock and roll.
Rock and roll. Right. And then some people push back. And so it's case by case.
What's the difference between like somebody like you and like bizbuysell.com?
Well, I list on BizBuySell.
Okay, cool.
Mhm.
So that's like
It's a platform.
it's an aggregator of the, like it's like a Zillow.
Yes.
It's pulling in the listings.
Yes,
Got it.
exactly.
Okay.
So anyone, and sometimes I tell people, if I can't help them or they don't necessarily want a broker, like, go list it on BizBuySell. So what I'm doing is, like I said, valuing it, doing the marketing.
Way more than just, brokering
Yeah.
the deal.
Yeah. I'm dealing with all the buyers, the non-disclosures, the lawyers, the accountants, the, lenders, all of those parts of it. Some people just want to try it on their own, and you can place an ad on BizBuySell.
Right.
So I use BizBuySell. I'm a member of the International Business Brokers Association. So I also, like I said, have contacts with brokers all over the country and lenders all over the country. So I list that way as well. And then because we are real estate agents, we can use the local MLS. So
I'm curious, and I'm not selling, but I get emails all the time of like, hey, we've got, you fit our criteria. We'd love to list your business or whatever. Like, interested. I'm curious if there's any validity to that. Like, do people actually have, you think, buyers like sitting on the sidelines waiting for businesses, or do you think that those are like more, I don't know, spammy, trying to get lead emails?
I get those all the time too, and I'm always unsure.
Yeah.
Some of them are legit, but I have had buyers inquire on my business listings, and I call them back and realize they're actually trying to steal the listings.
Ah, right.
I'm like, hang on.
Right.
Are you trying to buy this business and run it in Durango? And that's not the case. So,
Right.
but I get emails like that every day as well. I think some of them are legit.
Probably.
Yeah.
It's funny, I was telling you about, like, I can see how business owners be like, okay, I'm done. Today's the day.
Yes.
You send the right email at the right time to the right guy who's having
Right.
the bad day. And he's
Right.
like, yes, I'm
Yep.
interested.
Yep. Yes, please.
List this, the freaking thing.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's so funny. Jen, thank you so much.
Yeah.
this conversation has been so fun, so just enlightening and informative, and I'm just a sponge over here learning so much from you. So thank
It's
you for that.
yeah, it's really cool to talk about what I do. People don't know business brokers exist, and then when I tell them I'm a business broker, they don't know what that means.
Like, what is that?
Yeah, and I get it. I didn't either. Until I had owned a partnership in a business, I'd never thought about selling a business entity. So it's cool to talk about it. And I just finished this whole master's CBI program last year, so I'm like really excited about it. And
Right.
yeah, yeah. So
No, and
thanks for having me.
it's great. And Matt, and I've got I've my surprise shirt that I didn't tell you about
Ooh, no, you
before.
didn't tell me.
They're my Inspire by Example
Thank
shirts.
you. Awesome.
Because it's really cool. You're getting to live in a world, like, obviously, appreciate y'all sharing the insight and your expert knowledge and all of that good stuff. But you live in a world that's really cool where you get to help two dreams come true.
Yeah,
Like you get to help somebody finally have their exit, and you get to also help people realize their dream of business ownership
it's
and
true. Yeah,
entrepreneurship and all that stuff. And it's just neat. So
it
thank you
is.
for that
Yeah.
too, and for the knowledge and all of it. And we'll do this again sometime because
I'd love
this was
to.
great. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Thanks, Ben.